No.
Every time I go out of the room, it reconnects to the internet and then it does something nasty to my sheet. So it's bed would be a
Right, no, it's fine. So no.
Well, you need to
It does that with our
disconnect and
computers as
reconnect.
well.
Yeah.
Doesn't do it every time, just sometimes it just seems to cause problems. Okay. Have we established control? Okay, so we'll move ourselves back to near the start of the agenda and turn to policy 6, health and well-being. And to start with, it would be helpful if the council could explain what is meant by a rapid or more substantial health impact assessment.
Okay. Noreen Banks is dealing with this aspect of the hearing, so.
Thank you.
With regards to the rapid health impact assessment, there is a planning tool which was published by Public Health Northamptonshire, and that's Exam 9, and it details what a rapid health impact assessment should entail. So it is essentially a form that people are recommended to fill in, and it will ask questions such as physical activity, food, diet and obesity, transport and travel, and so on. There is a guidance note that accompanies the rapid HIA, and that's Exam 9A. The policy currently states that it will be applied to residential developments of 10 dwellings or more, or 1,000 square meters or more. We are proposing to modify that so that it will refer to all major developments.
Okay, that would make it consistent with other policies that refer to major development, doesn't it?
Yes, it will, yes.
Okay, perhaps you can outline the main modifications, please. The other ones. Could you outline the other main modifications, please?
Go through the main modifications.
Yes, of course.
Right, modification 2 is necessary for soundness because it refers to the design tool and will make the policy consistent with policy 3. Modification 2A is necessary because it refers to the application to all major developments. Modification 2B is being slightly modified. The last sentence refers to compete, to the word compete. We are recommending that the policy be amended to refer to all proposals for larger developments, and also that the larger developments will be expected to include a more substantial rapid health impact assessment rather than compete.
So what would the consequences be if a health impact assessment wasn't provided in a planning application? Is that a validation requirement?
It is a requirement which seeks to identify and assess the impact of a major development on the health and well-being of different groups of people. So it is essentially there to help decision makers make judgment on the impact of the proposals and to consider whether there are any positive impacts that will increase and how negative impacts can be reduced. So without the health impact assessment, it's not that easy to assess the impacts of major developments.
Okay. But is that a validation requirement at the planning application stage that one shall be provided, or would a planning application that didn't provide one be refused as being contrary to policy? Assuming this policy goes ahead in this form, I'm just trying to think through the consequences of the wording of the policy.
So would it have to be a validation requirement?
Yeah.
That's the question, isn't it?
Some councils have them as validation requirements and others
Might be
don't.
something that
To
we'll
the
have
local
Yeah.
requirements.
to consider.
Reflect on that.
It is something, because the point is policy, so it might be, I don't know for sure, it might be a validation requirement
It's not current.
from the borough, but it could be reflected on, could be included in future lists, but at the moment, so because the policy is still emerging, I don't think we've done this.
It's just the compulsion to provide that documentation through the policy, and if that isn't provided, would the council refuse planning permission on that basis?
It could do. Council have to take a view.
Yeah.
Policies are not.
I'm just thinking about the effectiveness of the policy. It's
Okay.
I think in terms of refusing an application or policy as a whole together with other policies, rather than the mere absence of producing the assessment helps you test whether or not it's meeting the other criteria in the policy. So it would be failing to meet the policy as a whole rather than just not providing the assessment.
just wondering if the information was provided in a different format. It wouldn't be provided in the form of a rapid health impact assessment, but it may be provided in a different format, which gave the council the information it needed. It would be inconsistent with the policy, but it would still... I'm just thinking about the wording, the compulsion that must be done in that form, and where the wording perhaps ought to be tweaked somewhat.
Similar, but
Yeah.
we're trying to be as clear as we can,
Yeah.
both to applicants and to development management officers in terms of what is expected and how best to demonstrate whether or not the policy is being complied with. So in that sense,
Yeah.
being clear and saying what we expect is helpful.
Oh, it is. It's just how effective it would be if someone chose to do it in a different way.
I think that would be reasonable as long as they demonstrate that they're meeting the policy
Yeah.
in a particular way. I think we can't say that would be acceptable. It would be our preference. But it would have to be acceptable because the critical thing is that they're meeting the policy.
Yeah.
Doesn't it link back to the discussion we had this morning on one of the other policies around knowing what the policy is seeking to achieve? If we know what the policy is seeking to achieve, we know then what factors to look at to determine whether the proposal is consistent with what the policy is meant to do.
I think so, and the bullet points, and we might need to look at the bullet points again, but those bullet points should set out what we'd expect. The bullet points over the policy are what the health impact assessment should help us assess.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
those 5 bullet points then, do they pull out what a health impact assessment that Ms Banks outlined, does it pick out those policies, that those sort of factors that a health impact assessment would look at?
No, if you look at paragraph 5.29, it refers to the tool and what would be required when preparing a rapid health impact assessment. The 5 bullet points just refers to the justification
Okay.
in terms of why it's required.
I think policy probably needs some further consideration in terms of the requirement for that information, how it would be provided, and the best way in which to capture really what information is needed in order to provide the council the information it needs to assess the health impact.
So would paragraph 5.29, if we build on what we've already written there, in terms of the tool, where we could find where they could find the tool, and the examples, that would be satisfactory.
Yes, but yeah. Well, and also I think the point about its health impact assessment or similar, it's just really just trying to capture that point, but it's not the only solution isn't for a rapid health impact assessment. And it's a need for it to be proportionate too.
Yeah, it probably, 5.29, it needs the reference to the things that you talked about, physical activity, diet, that sort of thing. Because obviously those factors can be assessed by something else other than the HIA.
Okay.
Yeah, so anybody looking at the policy and looking at the explanatory text can actually comply with it without going down the HIA route. They just look at the factors they need to measure.
Okay. We will review paragraph 5.29.
I think also consider the wording will be required to be supported by a rapid health impact assessment or whatever, because there's a staged approach there, isn't it? There's almost like a screening approach with the rapid assessment, and then it would then lead on to a more substantial assessment should significant impacts be identified. I think this will be required wording is the thing that causes me concern.
Right, okay.
So just how that's expressed through the policy. So I think we'll make a note of that, and we'll, if you can look at ways in which to address that, and we'll obviously respond to that in due course. Right. So the main modifications look into the changes, so it's all development and not just residential development, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Moving on to policy 7 now.
Yeah.
The flood risk and water management one. We've obviously got a question there, and this is again probably links to the discussion we had before lunch about the words having regard to. I mean, this is actually quite a short policy. It's whether it is dealt with by having regard to the guidance from the lead local flood authority and Annual Water, whether there is something in the guidance that could be put into the policy. But having said that, by doing that, you run the risk of having to go through advertising those modifications. So again, just get some reaction to that in terms of the discussion I suppose we had this morning.
Okay. Thank you, sir. We have proposed main mod 3A. So we'd replace the paragraph that starts proposals that and ends with will be supported with all proposals must demonstrate that they will assist in the management of flood risk, ensure flood risk is not increased elsewhere, and provide flood risk reduction stroke betterment. And then we go on to say proposals must also comply with relevant guidance from flood risk management and standards for surface water produced by the lead local flood authority and Anglian Water. And then we put in brackets all successor documents, which I appreciate doesn't get round the issue you've just highlighted.
But by adding the words having regard to rather than must comply with, that might well
indeed
do it. Because then you've got some factors in there and you've got the reference to the documents as well.
Yeah.
In terms of the Environment Agency's comments that they've made on this proposed modification around the design standards, do they improve the policy's clarity and address some or all of the ambiguity they've identified, especially around the proposals to include design standards? And I suppose that links back to what we've just discussed.
It does really, yes. I mean, just digging those out. Yes, I think they've added a bit onto the policy, haven't they? And they've also made various suggestions about the supporting text.
I suppose what I'm trying to get to is, do those comments, do they help clarity and remove ambiguity?
I think they do. I'm not sure that the final suggestion they've made for policy 7 is strictly necessary on the basis that it repeats policy in the joint core strategy. However, I think it's useful to have a reference to it in paragraph 5.32.
Can you have a look at that then?
Yeah.
Part of the process.
Of course, yeah.
And in terms of the modifications that are proposed, you've already mentioned one, but are they necessary for soundness then?
I think they are, because the way the policy was written before wasn't quite right, in the sense that it suggested, or it almost gave the impression that the requirements were optional, which clearly they're not.
Thank you. Mr. Lewis, have you got
No comments.
on that? Okay.
Yes, is policy 11 next?
Yeah.
So in terms of the application of the sequential test then, the two areas sort of, so it's the town centre boundary and the enterprise zone boundary of the areas considered to be, in effect, town centres in the framework language. Wondering whether the wording in the final paragraph is sufficiently clear. It's not using the same wording as the framework talks about without substantially undermining the potential for new hotels. If you're applying the sequential test, I'm wondering whether it would be more simple to say that developments for hotels and other locations must apply the sequential test in accordance with national policies of that in the framework, without sort of looking to, unless you're trying to do something different, and I'm not sure you are trying to do something different from the wording, just some of the wording isn't the same as what's in the framework.
Well, what we were trying to do was to emphasise that hotel developments are acceptable in the town centre boundary, within the town centre boundary, and also in the enterprise zone.
Yeah.
And the reason why the enterprise zone is included is because the hotel study, which is reference 1002, recommended an approach which prioritises hotel development in the town centre and the enterprise zone, primarily because one or more of those sites within the enterprise zone can accommodate fully serviced 3- and 4-star hotels with leisure facilities, and it is not possible to accommodate them in the town centre due to the land take. So that was why we formulated that policy.
I'm just wondering whether it's sufficiently clear to set out in terms of a sequential test the location, the starting point will be the town centre boundary and the enterprise zone,
Yeah.
the hotels, and then beyond that,
Yeah.
the sequential test would be applied as per national policy.
Okay. Yeah. We
Okay.
can review that policy.
Because that was my understanding reading of the hotel study. It's
Yeah.
the evidence is there to justify
Okay.
the identification, I think, of the enterprise zone as an equal location to the town centre in terms of the sequential test. You got anything? No. Policy 12, I think you're proposing a main modification to address our comments. We're deleting reference to the central area.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, that's fine. Next one I have is policy 19. Right, this is concerning the retail of centres, or hierarchy of centres, retail and community services. And the question's really about the thresholds and the levels of floor space that have been put forward. And I think it would be useful just to confirm the context and how things have changed since the core strategy was put into place. So I did spend some time looking at documents last week, looking at the retail study, central area local plan, and noting the amount of development that's happened in terms of retail provision since then. So am I right in understanding that in terms of the level of provision that's proposed, that's in effect the residual that needs to be provided for following the provision that's already been made, or indeed has come forward?
This, I don't think you can kind of draw it in that way. I think this is more about an understanding of the the economics and in the latest situation. and the work that was done by Nexus in the retail study sort of essentially came up with these numbers. So there will have been some development in the town over that period. Won't necessarily have been in the centres that are allocated in the plan.
No.
So it's probably more a reflection of the change in the economics of retailing, customer spend and so on, between the 2012 when the study was done for the joint core strategy and 2018 when we had this work done for our plan. Obviously the Central Area Action Plan had plans for the Northampton Town Centre which never came off as regards expansion of the Grosvenor Centre and so on.
Okay. So these policies are, as we discussed before, replacing the Central Area Plan
Yes.
with this plan. And what is going to happen to Joint Core Strategy Policy N2? Because this is moving on the figures from that, isn't it?
It is. I suppose it is updating those policies in the sense that it's a reflection of the facts of the economy, how that's changed over the sort of 6-year intervening period, essentially.
Okay. So I've not got N2 in front of me, but what's going to happen to N2? Because it's not one of the policies that's proposed to be superseded in part, is it? Or is it the case of parts of it will be superseded with updated figures in what would be the most recent plan?
Yes, I think it's fair to say that it essentially it updates the numbers, but it doesn't change the thrust of that policy. Yes, and the Central Area Action Plan has happened, and as I say, the development, we are replacing the Central Area Action Plan with this policy. So, policy N2, it's saying what the Central Area Action Plan will do, isn't it? And we are replacing the Central Area Action Plan.
Yeah. So, in terms of N2, what actually remains current? That's the question, I think. So, is it sort of the figures change? Town centre boundary, primary shopping area. That change. And that's sort of being replaced in part, isn't it?
Yes. The focus on the Grosvenor Centre, I mean, that was a major scheme that would involve the massive expansion of the Grosvenor Centre, which sort of rapidly proved not to be something that the market was willing to be involved with anymore.
So, if the Central Area Action Plan is being replaced, that paragraph, it's happened, it's
Yes.
been replaced, it's gone, isn't it? So that second paragraph,
Yes.
N2, is gone.
The numbers were in the Central Area Action Plan.
I'm just wondering whether the 19 would actually be a direct replacement for N2.
Hmm.
And relates to, so that N2 relates to Northampton Central Area, doesn't relate to anywhere beyond the boundaries of the former borough. I'm just wondering whether it's one of the policies that would be superseded and needs to be identified as such, just for the interest of clarity, so we don't end up with an out-of-date policy and
And an up-to-date one.
within the same development plan envelope.
And I think it is fair to say that all elements of N2 are now out of date, and the figures only went to 2026 anyway. So it may be that it's best to identify that as a superseded policy
I think so.
in the core strategy.
Do we identify that as something to
We'll have
you take away another
Yes.
thing
definitely,
through?
yeah, we
Just in
can-
case there aren't any implications we're not immediately going to uncover now. I don't think there should be, but I think it's probably best to reflect upon it. So, in which case, we're left with a replacement policy that sets out ranges in terms of provision. And I just wonder some discussion maybe about the effectiveness of that. What is
Okay.
the figure that will be supported? And what is it not just up to the uppermost figure? Because if the uppermost figure is justified, why is there a lower figure?
Okay.
I'm just not clear on the.
No, I mean this was set out in the evidence, but and essentially what it was the range, for example, in the convenience figures, was because the smaller the figure represents expenditure per square metre, just taking the big four supermarkets sort of sales densities into account, whereas the larger figure assumes that 50% of the convenience expenditure will be in the big four and the remainder in discounters, which apparently have lower sales densities, which is why you need a bigger number. And similarly, for comparison, that our consultants sort of took a low and a high sales density scenario, comparing the situation in Northampton to other similarly sized towns in the country. So it's tables 6.2 and 6.6 in the retail and leisure survey that kind of give that guidance, but that doesn't alter your point, does it?
No. So the plan needs to be clear, and I'm not sure if we're in the world where there's a lot of maybe retail proposals, and maybe the world of retail inquiries is one that is largely behind us. I don't know, but I could imagine those figures being poured across for quite some time as to what they might mean, and
I think it's it would seem sensible on the face of it to just have the higher figure in each case.
I mean, and maybe sort of up to with an explanation that is based upon the broad retail mix, not large supermarket format or whatever the phrases would be. Okay.
Yes, we can certainly look at that, sir.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I've gone back through and looked at the evidence again on the 500 square metre threshold for the application of the sequential test. I think I did note there that This study referred to retail assessments of that scale being proportionate. And wondering why you chose not to run with that advice in the plan. It's a fairly modest scale development potentially.
Okay. Yes, I don't. I think we can certainly look into that issue about the proportionate level of.
Yeah, I mean it could be an additional wording in paragraph 911, where it says that the recommendation was for 500 square metres retail impact assessment.
Okay. Yeah.
Again, if this may be something that would possibly sit in the council's validation requirements already, there may be something there that describes that. Maybe not. I haven't looked, but
We can check that out, sir.
thank you. Okay, you've addressed the use classes order changes for the main modification.
Yeah.
The next question related to the marketing. And again, it's a range, 12 to 18 months.
Yes.
And we discussed earlier on about the council's approach to marketing. I assume there's a similar answer here. You don't have a policy or guidance on marketing.
We don't. And in terms of the range, we'd be doing away with that and changing it to 18 months. That's it's in a proposed main mod.
What's the justification for 18, and why is that different than, say, 12 months for employment land, given the nature of town centres and retail premises and not really wanting to have vacant premises for an undue period?
I suppose it's wanting to be particularly convinced that there has been, a genuine opportunity for the market to pick premises up. And it's what the study recommended, so
I think that's one we'll need to reflect upon a bit more. Go back and have a look at the evidence and maybe try
yes, sir.
to get to the bottom of the 18 months, because it does seem quite a long period. Note to myself that. Now, I've just got a note to myself to remind myself of para 1, 2, 3 of the framework, which implores local authorities to take a positive approach to applications for alternative uses of land currently developed but not allocated. Again, that's caveated by not affecting vitality and viability of town centres. But is 18 months a positive period of time?
Okay, sir.
Okay, we will reflect on that further. Moving on to policy 20, hot food takeaways. So that's a form of development could potentially fall under the health impact assessment if it's a large scale development. I'm just wondering whether the provision of food, has the council given any thought to whether the provision of hot food takeaways could fall under the health impact assessment requirement?
That's I think it would have to if we didn't have this policy in place. We've got clear evidence as to why there should be a policy on hot food takeaways, but yes, on that substantive point, I think if we didn't have this policy, then we'd be looking at health impact assessments.
Okay. Okay, in terms of effectiveness, the first part of the policy is concerned with managing locations of and access to unhealthy eating facilities. And then that would be done, it suggests, by limiting facilities within 400 metres of any entrance to a school. The question I would have is, what is the causal link evidence between obesity and school premises, given that yes, there is a higher level of adult obesity in England average in the borough, but not children, and this appears to be a policy targeted at children. Have you considered the location of hot food takeaways in relation to school premises? Have you considered the incidence of free school meals, school policies in relation to children being allowed to leave during the day, particularly primary schools where it doesn't happen very often?
Noreen.
The evidence that we use to inform this policy is the obesity health and well-being report reference 1005, and that report concluded that in Northampton 68% of the adult population over 16 are overweight and obese, and this is higher than the England average of 62%. Children in particular were showing levels of 22.7% for 4 to 5 year olds, rising to 36% for 10 to 11 year olds. And that report also refers to the statistical correlation between the density of fast food outlets and obesity in Northampton. Northampton has the third highest density in the country at 86.9 per 100,000. And the report also states that the single most common planning policy adopted to promote health is the introduction of takeaway food outlet exclusion zones around locations that are frequented by children and families. And they also refer to the fact that limiting this use in specific areas like schools is supported by government as well. The 400 metre restriction, again, is based on Public Health England's guidance, and that is reference 1006. They consider the 400 metre or 5-minute walk to be a reasonable walking distance in an exclusion buffer zone.
Has there been a specific study in relation to the location of hot food takeaways in schools and the effects on obesity relating to Northampton?
I need to go back and just review what's in the obesity study, obesity briefing in Northampton. that was done in March 2020. I think from my recollection, yes it is, but I need to just go back and confirm that. From my recollection, there is a map showing schools in Northampton and location of takeaways, but I need to go back and double check that.
Is there, beyond that, so is there evidence that actually shows a causal link between areas where they have higher incidence of obesity? I mean, this is a policy area that I've come across several times in local plan examinations, and it's this causal link between the location of hot food takeaway, the school, the youth club, or whatever's suggested to go into the policy, and the 400 metre restriction is the thing that I would question. I don't question at all the issues to do with obesity and access to unhealthy food, but it's just a way in which it can be done in a sound land use planning way. And where these policies do tend to exist, they tend to exist in SPD rather than development plan policies. And typically where there are restrictions in development plan policies, it tends to be on the viability and vitality arguments, particularly for local shopping parades, etc. There's some in London, maybe Camden may have a policy, but I think that was found sound on the basis of the retail evidence.
Yeah.
I think that was Camden, wasn't it?
It was Camden, so yes, I did Camden, so I remember the debate at Camden, but Stevenage is certainly there was found sound restriction there. And of course, this was all in fact before the PPG was revised, I think it's fair to say, to actually indicate that exclusion zones could be justified by reference to local evidence. And I think obviously there is an issue here in terms of when over a third of 10 to 11-year-olds are obese and nearly a quarter of 4 to 5-year-olds are obese within the borough. You might say this is an instance where at the very least a precautionary approach is justified, if nothing else.
It's whether the approach is actually limiting. Is it correct to limit it to the tie it to the location of the school, or are there other land use planning ways of actually dealing with the issue? Because it may not be to do with the location of the school. That may not, unless there's evidence that actually can demonstrate mapping of schools and incidence of obesity, etc. It may be a more general problem to do with the numbers of hot food takeaways across the borough area in general terms.
Well, if that were right, then the PPG wouldn't advocate the use of exclusion zones. And I think it's fair to say that Public Health England, using the planning system to promote healthy weight environments, does stress the relationship, and it's particularly congregation of young people, and therefore relationship to schools. But also, and you mentioned primary school age children, my recollection is also refers to even with parents, young children passing hot food takeaways close to schools can be, as it were, a draw. So it's all there in terms of, as it were, to the extent there is evidence of a causal link. It's very difficult, I think, to establish a clear causal relationship. But you come back to the figures. If Northampton has one of the highest densities of hot food takeaways in the country and significant obesity issues in the young, it should be doing something to address that.
Yes, and we've got to take a view on whether the evidence supports the approach as set out here, or whether to invite the council to consider a different approach in order to address it.
Yeah, but we can look to see in the evidence base to see whether or not we can draw a closer link between the areas of schools and incidence of obesity.
Yes, if you can provide that. Just a note of what's in the evidence base, that would be helpful. But it's one for us to take away and, excuse the pun, and we'll carry out. and form a view on, and I think probably write to you in our letter in due
Okay.
course.
Right, that's I suppose something to chew on. So we'll move on to policy 21.
There's no end to these puns. We can
Sorry.
do this all afternoon.
Get rid of it. I'm sorry. Policy 21, residential development on upper floors. I think well, I'll ask Council first. Does the policy serve a clear purpose and is it clearly written and unambiguous, so it is evident how a decision maker should react to the proposal? And I've probably got a couple of questions based on what you might say.
Okay. We've tweaked this policy. I mean, this applies in designated centres, so it's the town centre and the other centres in the retail hierarchy. We've modified the policy, or proposed a modification to the policy, such that it would read instead, residential development within the town centre will be specifically supported where this is above the ground floor, and has access which does not require people to pass through a business use. I think this just makes it a bit clearer as to what the policy intention is. It's about encouraging town centre living.
My other question, or the follow-up question to that, is should the encouragement of town centre living just be restricted to upper floors? There was an answer that, I think a written answer that was given to question 134. The vacancy period, that implied to me that there was some flexibility about the use of the ground floor for residential as well.
Yes.
Bearing in mind as well the change in retail that have probably occurred since the 2018 study.
Yes, indeed, and the sort of changes in permitted development rights and so on as well.
Yeah.
So yeah. So I suppose yes, on the upper floors we've got it covered in that policy, but yes, I think yes, you've identified the issue about the modification 12A as well.
So would it be reasonable then to modify this policy to allow some form of residential on ground floor in these retail areas as well?
I think the issue would be that we would, whilst we appreciate the, there is that flexibility within the sort of general policy environment in which we all work, we wouldn't necessarily want to encourage residential use of shop units right in the centre of Northampton, for example. Because we're aware that there's been substantial change already in a lot of the centres in Northampton, and to I don't think we'd necessarily support the wholesale change of all shops into residential.
I can see the point there.
Yeah, no, I think that just relates back to parts of policy 19, sort of the private shopping area, and the council wishing to retain active frontages.
Yes, indeed.
I was thinking of active frontages. And so in terms of question 139, are the proposed modifications necessary for soundness?
I think I think, yeah, the proposed modification is necessary to improve the soundness, or for soundness, sorry.
And it does make it more specific, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Got another point
No.
on that? I'll move on to the policy 23, then the sports facilities one. I think the first point I'd make here in terms of question 140 is the policy consistent with national policy for space and recreation as set out in 98 and 99 of the framework. About duplicating national policy. It doesn't quite duplicate not the national policy because it seems to miss out the ors between the various aspects of it.
Okay.
Probably miss out. It's when it talks about sport playing and facilities of playing pitches is defined in special set should be safeguarded from development unless. And the I think the framework has an or after requirements, but you've got the or after the so
Yes,
is that a deliberate or is that something that
Noreen Banks is going to
Yeah.
sort of answer the questions on this policy.
I will try anyway. The reason behind the formulation of this policy is essentially to ensure that we have the criteria in place to safeguard existing sports facilities and playing pitches. It might be that we have not taken every single word from the NPPF as such, but we wanted to put the criteria in there to ensure that that we are able to specify what's required when it comes to the management of sports facilities and playing pitches.
So was it the
Yeah.
intention to lift the NPPF and put it in there? In other words, I
It
would say
was.
that make it consistent with what the NPPF says, or do something different in terms of what you're seeking to do with the policy.
It was intended to reinforce the message that was in the NPPF, primarily because Northampton being a built-up area and having to deal with a variety of competing uses within its relatively small area boundary, we needed to come up with a list of criteria in which to assess any schemes that come forward.
So in terms of, just to make sure I'm clear then, in terms of in policy 23, letter A, it says an assessment has been undertaken which has clearly shown that the facility is surplus to requirements, and then you've got a semicolon and the planning, the framework would have an or after that. Is that something that should be in there? That's what
Yeah.
I'm getting at.
Okay,
Yeah.
we can look at this again
Yeah.
and update it.
Okay. Thank you for that. The next point, I think, is one of these points where it talks about sports facilities in West Northamptonshire, which is not part of the development plan. It's one of the points that we were making earlier about
Yeah.
whether it should have regard to that rather
Yeah.
than just be in line with the recommendations. And again, it's the points we've made all the way through today's session, I think. So it's considering that along with the others.
Okay.
And then moving on then to policy 24.
Oh, good.
Sorry.
Just a quick point on policy 23. In the first bullet point, it includes the text as defined in the justification text. I'm just wondering whether what is that trying to do? Whether that's necessary? And
Yes, that was included because people were saying, or when we were consulting People were not clear about the differences between sports facilities, playing pitches, and then we've obviously got other policies relating to open space, sport and recreation. So we thought that we would signpost people to the justification text. But I see what you mean when you say, is it necessary?
Yes, because it's...
I think we could probably add a definition in the glossary of sports facilities would be a better way of doing it.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
So if we can move on then to policy 24, community facilities. And again, it's around whether the policy is clearly written and will be effective. And it's around perhaps clarifying what is meant by a sustainable location, and making sure that perhaps includes a reference to public transport, walking or cycling.
We included the term sustainable location because we refer to the site. If you look at the second paragraph, the bullet point in the second paragraph refers to the site being accessible by public transport and other sustainable transport modes, including walking and cycling. So we consider the term sustainable location to be important to remain in the main body of the policy.
In terms of clarifying the policy, then would it help to well, it refers to sustainable location in the second line to actually define that as a location that's accessible by sustainable transport modes, including walking or cycling, or some reference to that bullet point. So the policy is tied together.
Okay. We can
clearly
review that. Yeah.
Mr. Lewis,
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of how the issues we discussed earlier, I think, comes down to accessible location as opposed to sustainable, because what is meant by sustainable location? The framework has its own definition of sustainability. This isn't that. This is about access by things other than the private car, I think, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I would look at that, and then I just wonder whether this can give you some economy with the text, because the first paragraph sort of repeats a lot of what's in the second paragraph before we get to the bullet points. I just wonder whether, to be more effective, that there could be some economy in the text.
Yeah, we could certainly look at that.
And then that can then relate directly to the accessible by public transport and other sustainable transport modes bit. And again, be clear as to what sustainable transport modes are. Maybe define them as modes other than the private car.
and then we've got the question 143 around the missing word.
Yes, the missing word is facilities. And that's modification 13A.
And then move on then to policy 25, childcare provision, which I think will have the same debate about sustainable locations,
Yeah.
and ensuring that that is clearly defined within the policy.
Yeah.
And then finally, I think it's finally, we'll check our questions in a minute, but the next one is policy 26, sites for burial space. So the first question is the policy consistent with the framework in regard to net gains for biodiversity? Because there were some issues that were raised in the consultation responses on that.
Yeah, we do accept that it might not be completely consistent with the framework. While it makes reference to there being no harm on biodiversity, it doesn't actually refer to net gains. So we are recommending that the last sentence be modified to rectify this, and that's in modification 13C.
And so therefore, in that respect, does that address the main point in the consultation?
Yes, it should do, yes.
Mr. Lewis, have you got any?
No, thank you.
I think that's the end of our questions, I think.
I think it is, yes. I just wonder whether it will be possible to go through the actions rising from today, maybe an update on the actions from the first week.
Yes, certainly.
We'll take adjournment for a bit just to get that sorted and then email anything across to Mr. Kemp.
Yes.
How long do you think you need? It's probably, we'll probably
Half
do
an
a
hour,
break.
I would have thought. Is that okay?
Yeah. Well, should we? Let's be generous and say let's resume at 3:45. and that
Okay.
should give us time to do it. Any issues, just let Mr. Kemp know,
Thank
and we
you.
can. We've got rest of the day, haven't we?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so we'll adjourn now until 3:45, and we'll pick up then.
Is there- Just forgive me. Have we covered everything? There were questions on 175.
Should have checked you. Didn't have anything else.
What number?
175.
I think we covered that.
You're happy we've dealt with that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, we dealt with that in the infrastructure, didn't we?
Yeah, we did.
Okay.
Because it was one area that Ms. Green was interested in.
So you're happy?
Yeah.
We've got everything you need. That's fine.
Yes,
Just
thank
let me
you, yeah.
check you've got everything
Okay.
you need. That's
Thank
fine.
you. Right.